Hi, and welcome to section 2.6 for Econ 2 on the AQA exam board. What will we see today? Well, today we'll be looking at aggregate supply, both in the short run and the long run, and we will also be looking at the Keynesian and classical view of aggregate supply. But what is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply is defined as the volume of goods and services produced over a given time period. Aggregate supply measures the ability of an economy to produce goods and services that meet demand. Consumer goods, capital goods, public goods, merit goods, and goods for overseas markets, exports, are included in aggregate supply. We have aggregate supply in both the short and the long run. Let's first look at aggregate supply in the short run. The short run aggregate supply is denoted as SRAS. It shows how total planned output changes in response to a change in the price level, whilst keeping the prices and productivity of factors of production the same. SRAS is upward sloping due to the law of supply. The law of supply states that as the price level increases, firms are willing to bring more goods and services to the market. As the price level decreases, firms are willing to bring less goods and services to the market, and this is why SRAS is upward sloping. An increase in price level means an increase in real output, and a decrease in price level means a decrease in real output. Therefore, a change in the price level results in a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve. A change in the condition of supply will result in the SRAS curve shifting. The change in the condition of supply would have to be a surprise to firms. If firms were expecting there to be a change in the condition of supply, they would already have factored this change into their production processes, and the SRAS curve would incorporate this change. Therefore, in order for there to be a shift, this change needs to be a shock. A favourable change / shock. A favourable shock will cause an outward shift in the SRAS curve, and an adverse shock would cause the SRAS curve to shift inwards. Here are some examples of causes for shifts in the SRAS curve. One example is changes in employment costs, which are wages and employment taxes. Suppose that the government increases the national minimum wage, it doubles it. That would cause the cost of production for firms to increase. This would mean that firms are less willing to supply these goods to the market, which would cause the SRAS curve to shift inwards. Now suppose that there was mass immigration into this country. As there's mass immigration into this economy, there are now plenty of workers to choose from. The supply of individuals who are willing to work has increased. This causes the market clearing wage to be reduced, making it cheaper for firms to employ workers. This is a favourable change in employment costs, and this would cause the SRAS curve to shift outwards, because firms are willing to supply more goods to the market at a given price level. Another example of causes for a shift in the SRAS curve are changes in other factor costs such as raw materials. Commodity prices around the world are constantly changing as supply and demand changes. These changes affect the SRAS curve. A rise in the price of these raw materials would be an adverse shock for SRAS. This would cause the SRAS curve to shift inwards. A fall in the price of raw materials would be a favourable shock, and this would cause the SRAS curve to shift outwards. Oil is a key commodity for firm, as this is in joint demand, meaning that it is demanded by many different uses, and there are very few substitutes for oil. Government policy can also cause shifts in the SRAS curve. If a government wishes to push through certain environmental laws or taxes that make the cost of production more expensive, then the SRAS curve will shift inwards. This is because firms will require a higher price in order to bring this output to the market. Governments can also change corporation tax levels. An increase in corporation tax reduces the incentive for firms to produce goods and services, resulting in an inward shift of short-run aggregate supply. A reduction in income tax would have the opposite effect. It would increase the incentive for firms to produce goods and services, and this would cause the SRAS curve to shift outwards. So now let's move on to the long-run aggregate supply curve. The LRAS is the maximum amount of output that an economy can produce. On the ADAS diagram, the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. Later on in this video, we will look at what the long-run aggregate supply curve and what the short-run aggregate supply curve look like. The LRAS curve is determined by all factors of production, such as the size of the workforce, the size of the capital stock, and labour productivity levels. A change in a factor that affects an economy's potential output will cause a shift in the LRAS curve, whereby a favourable factor causes the LRAS curve to shift outwards because an economy can produce more, and an adverse factor causes the LRAS curve to shift inwards. Here are a few examples of causes for a shift in the LRAS curve. One example is an increase in investment levels, either investing in human or non-human capital. An increase in investment levels will cause the LRAS curve to shift outwards. Investing in new machineries and training the workforce allows the workforce to become more productive, which means that an economy can now produce more goods and services than it did before the investment levels increased. Another cause of a shift in the LRAS curve would be technological advancement. Examples of technological advancement would be robots, artificial intelligence, and autonomous vehicles. All three of these examples would allow the economy to produce more goods and services than it currently does now. This would be represented graphically by an outward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. A natural disaster such as a hurricane or an earthquake would result in the LRAS curve shifting inwards. This is because a natural disaster would damage the resources of a nation. A natural disaster would destroy factories and damage infrastructure. This would mean that an economy wouldn't be able to produce the same amount of goods and services as they would have been able to produce if there wasn't a natural disaster. This means that the LRAS curve shifts inwards because the productive potential of the economy has been reduced. There are two views of the long-run aggregate supply curve. One view is the classical view, and the other one is the Keynesian view. Let's first look at the classical view of the LRAS curve. The classical view believes that the LRAS curve is always perfectly inelastic. In the long run, an economy will be in an equilibrium with the maximum amount of output being produced. They also believe that in the long run the price level is flexible, and the price level will change in order for the economy to be at an equilibrium where the maximum amount of output that the economy can be produced is produced. In the classical view, an economy can also be in a short-run equilibrium. We'll explore this further later. So here we have an example diagram. We've got the price level and real output as our two axes. You can see from the diagram that the long-run aggregate supply is perfectly inelastic and points upwards. We can also see that SRAS has been plotted and aggregate demand has also been plotted. At the long-run equilibrium, the price level in this market will be PL, and the level of output will be the maximum amount of output, which is Y. The second view of the long-run aggregate supply curve is the Keynesian view. This view states that the economy could be in an equilibrium in the long run where output is below its potential, or its maximum. This results in unemployed factors of production. In the Keynesian view, we have an upward sloping LRAS curve, which you can see in the diagram. The maximum output of this economy is Y star, An economy will be in equilibrium when aggregate demand intercepts the upward sloping part of the LRAS curve. For a level of aggregate demand of AZ1, the economy will be in equilibrium at point A with a price level of PL1 and a level of real output of Y1. Real output is less than the maximum output, meaning that the economy has a negative output gap of Y star minus Y1. The economy is not producing as many goods and services as it could. Let's suppose now that we have a lower level of aggregate demand in the economy, for example, AD2. With aggregate demand being AD2, the equilibrium in the economy will be at point B, with a price level of PL2 and an output level of Y2. This real output level is less than it was when aggregate demand was AD1, and this means that the economy is in a long-run equilibrium with an even bigger output gap than when we had aggregate demand AD1. The negative output gap for AD2 is Y star minus Y2. When there is a large negative output gap in an economy, Keynesian economists believe that the government has a role to stimulate demand and push the economy to producing a level of real output that is nearer to the economy's maximum level of output, i.e. push the economy from Y2 closer to the maximum level of output, which is Y star. With the Keynesian view of the long-run aggregate supply curve, as aggregate demand increases, we move up the upwards sloping part of the long-run aggregate supply curve. This leads to a smaller increase in output, but a larger increase in the price level. We will look at the differences between the Keynesian view of the LRAS curve and the classical view of the LRAS curve in more detail in sections 3 and 4.